Our topic is Leila Seder, and the overall message of Pesach that we should discuss, that we should mention at the Seder, and in general, every day of the year for that matter, because precisely for this reason, we are commanded to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim every day of the year, twice a day. So if we look at the well-known Parashat HaChodesh, this is Shemot Perek Yod Bet. Let us open that up for one moment. All right, so we're looking now at Shemot Perek Yod Bet. Parashat HaChodesh. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. Rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. The first thing we see here is that the Torah is telling us that this month of Nisan is to be the beginning of our calendar. The truth is that this is not unique to Judaism. There are many calendars, ancient calendars, Iranian and other ancient calendars with which we are familiar, that began the year in the spring, at the time of the spring equinox. The spring equinox, the present point in history, takes place between the 19th and the 21st of March, Le Mignonam. At this point in time, the 20th of March. These things can drift and shift somewhat over time, as they in fact do, as we will discuss. So, marking the year from beginning the year, from the spring, that is to be more specific, the spring equinox, that is to say, that day, which is essentially the beginning of spring, when the day and night are equal in time, is essentially roughly the beginning of Pesach. Even ancient peoples became aware of this astronomical fact because people observed that the sun rises at a certain point over the horizon, the eastern horizon, from the winter through the summer. It doesn't rise at the same point every day. It shifts from one extreme, which is further to the south, and the other further to the north. That's at least in the northern hemisphere. So, and people noted that when the sun rose at the midpoint of these two distant points, where the extreme points to the right and the left, to the north and the south, where the sun would rise on the eastern horizon, people noted eventually that when it is at that midpoint, it is also that point when the day and the night are equal, and that is the spring equinox. Now, the spring equinox used to be, this is no longer the case because of the precession of the equinoxes, because of the overall large-scale, long-term changes in the workings of the solar system, and the change of the axis and the Earth's rotation over a very long period of time. So this is no longer the case, but it used to be the case in ancient times that the spring equinox took place when the sun was observed to be in what is known as Mazal Taleh. In other words, opposite a certain, or in line with a certain constellation. In other words, a certain obvious bright star in that constellation would be visible, would be observable shortly before the morning, shortly before the sun rising. And this Mazal, this constellation, was known in many ancient cultures as Mazal Taleh, the sheep's head constellation, and that is its sign to this day, the sign of a ram's horns. The pasuk goes on to the next pasuk says, "Dabaru al kol adat Yisrael lebod be'asor lachodesh hazeh," on the 10th day of this month. "Weikhu lahem ish sa leveth oboth sa labayith." Now we just mentioned that at this time of year, at that time, the spring equinox took place when the sun was said to be and observed to be in alignment with Mazal Taleh, with that constellation. Today, it is no longer the case. Mazal Taleh is now later. In other words, that correlation no longer exists. But in ancient times, that used to be the case. And what do we see here? The pasuk, the beginning of Parashat HaChodesh, immediately begins speaking about what? A seh. A seh is a lamb, a sheep. Goes on to say, if the household is not large enough to account for one lamb, one sheep that will be consumed at the Korban Pesach, then you join forces with another family. Because the point, of course, is, as we're about to see, the point is that this sheep, this lamb, will be consumed completely, so that there should not be leftovers. He goes on to say, "Sa'famim zachar ben shana yelachem min hakevasim umin ha'izim tikahu." One can take either from sheep or from goats. Now, when are you supposed to do this? On the 10th day of the month. One obvious question is, if we're about to be told down pasuk well, it's supposed to be slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan, which is actually the day of, or around exactly more or less the time, at least in those times, of the spring equinox. If it's to be done on the 14th of the month, why are we being told to take it on the 10th of the month? Why could you not worry about getting this lamb organized and in place?
T'as une question pour le Rav, là? Parce qu'il est en train de faire un Q&A, le deuxième.
I would request that everybody mutes the microphone. Okay. So why are we being told to take this on the 10th when we don't need it till the 14th? Further, we are told that it is to be slaughtered. Ben Ha'arbaim is explained by Hazal to mean in the afternoon, the second half of the day. It cannot be done before midday. وَلَكَهُ مِنْ هَدَمْ وَنَثَنُ عَلْ شْتَيْهَا مِزُزَوْهُ عَلَى مَشْقَوْفِ عَلْ هَبَطِيمْ أَشَيْ يَخَلُوا أَثَوْ بَهَمْ. Why is this being done? Why does that house have to be marked out? So this should look different. Why do we have to have the house look different from the the Egyptians' houses. And the meat of this lamb, this Korban Pesach, is to be consumed at that night. Thali esh, and it has to be dafka barbecued, roasted, umasoth, with masoth, al merurim yochaluhu, together with merurim. Al tochalu mimenu na, it cannot be eaten raw. Uvashal mevushal b'mayim, or cooked in water, in liquid fluid of some kind. Ki'im thali esh, it has to be specifically roasted, barbecued. Rosho al kara'a wa al kirbo. Walo thothiru mimenu al bokir, it has to be roasted whole, and none of it can be left till the morning. Wahanothar mimenu al bokar ba'esh tisrofu. So there are obvious questions. Why all these requirements for this korban? Now we know from various historical sources that the ancient Egyptians had an equinox festival on this very day, on the 14th day of Nisan, the day of the equinox, or the day before. The central god of the Egyptians, the most important deity, was the sun, and this was known as the festival of the god who in Egyptian was called Ra, Resh Ain, or R-A, represented usually in English, but it was pronounced with an Ain, Ra. And because we're talking about the equinox, which has to do with the sun rising in a certain spot on that day, and the day and the night being equal at that time, so this has everything to do with the astronomical realities. Where is the sun, and in which constellation is the sun on this day, at this time of the spring equinox? And not surprisingly, the symbol of this Egyptian god, Ra, was a lamb, a sheep, the head of a sheep. That is exactly why that constellation was, its notation in astronomical charts, etc., was this sign of the lamb, or of a sheep. And that is the sign of that month. And we know, again, from historical sources, that the Egyptians did not take this lamb or prepare it on that very day, but they prepared it a few days before. And they would slaughter it on the 14th. Of that month. So this sounds, no doubt, to all of us very familiar. This is exactly what the Egyptians are doing as well. So what the Torah is stating, and this was very obvious to someone who lived at that time, much less obvious to us perhaps, unless we really begin to study and look into it. But everybody knew that this is what the Egyptians do at this time. They also took a lamb, which they slaughtered this time. They prepared it days ahead, and we are being told to do the same thing, to prepare it days ahead. We are being told to slaughter it on the 14th, but at what particular point on the 14th? Normally, when there's a mitzvah to be performed on a certain day, there is a mitzvah to be performed on a certain day, or on a certain date, then all of that day is the right time. As the Mishnah states in Masechet Mechila, Kol hayom kasher Rik'at Halel or Rik'at Shofar. When you have a mitzvah to do something on a certain day, you can do it any time, all of that day, from morning to evening. But here the Torah states that you cannot do it all day. You can only do it half of the day, beginning at midday. Right? Ben ha'arbaim, as we said in Pasuk. Well, it has to be done. V'shahatu otho kol kahal hadath Yisrael ben ha'arbaim. And we also, again, from these historical sources, we know that the celebrations of the Egyptians on that day reached their pinnacle at midday. Now, so what we see is that the Korban Pesach, in some ways, paralleled the actions of the Egyptians, but in many ways was also the opposite. In other words, they also prepared a keves some days ahead of this date, and we are told to do the same thing. They were aiming for this particular day of the year, and so are we. So that time, at least, was the spring equinox, which occurred from our perspective today about 12 days ago, or something like that, 13 days ago, on the 20th of March. On the other hand, we are told to do things very differently from the Egyptians. The Egyptians would slaughter the animal from the morning. We are told not to do it in the morning, in order to be different. We are told to do it specifically ben ha'arbaim, from midday onwards. We are told in Pasuk Het, وَأَخَلُوا الْبَصَارَ بَلَيْلَ هَذَا. We are told that following evening to eat the meat of this sacrifice, of this Korban Pesach. Whereas the Egyptians were not allowed to eat of this meat. What did they do with the meat? It's recorded that they used to sell the meat on the next day. In other words, they would leave it over till the next day, and then they would sell it to non-Egyptians who were looked down upon as, untouchables, because these are the kinds of people who had different practices. As we see, for example, can you see source number 4 before you? Bereshit. Yes. Bereshit, Perek Mem Wav, Pasuk Lamed Daled. What does Yosef say to his brothers when they come to Mithraim? Wa'amartem anshe mikneh. Wa'amartem anshe mikneh hayu avodecha min ne'oreno wa'ad'ata. We and our forefathers, we have always been shepherds. Gam anachnu, gam avotenu. Ba'avur teshavu ba'aretz Goshen. So that Paro will tell you to go and live in the land of Goshen, which is a very specific part of Mithraim. Why? The Egyptians cannot bear these people because the sheep for them was a holy animal, and it could not be touched, it could not be eaten. So anyone who was a shepherd to them was looked down upon and was shunned, and they didn't want to have anything to do with these people. So the Egyptians would sell the meat of this korban, this sacrifice of theirs, to non-Egyptians, people who were not part of their religion, of their cult. We are being told, on the other hand, in Pasuk Het, we are being told, on the other hand, in Pasuk Heth, وَأَخَلُوا الْبَصَارَ وَلَيْلَ هَذَا. You shall eat the meat. They don't, you must. And they were not allowed to roast it, but you are going to specifically have to roast it, barbecue it. Thali esh umasot al merorim yochaluhum. And those who did, the priests, etc., who did partake, who had something to do with this sacrifice, this korban, had to do so, eat it raw or mivushal, cooked, but not roast. We are told to do the precisely the opposite. And they would leave it over till the next day and sell it to others. We are told, in Pasuk Yod. And that is why, and that which is left over for whatever reason, if anything is left over to the morning, it has to be burnt. So what we see is that, as Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim, that these animals, the animals that we do sacrifice, namely cows, sheep, and goats, these were chosen, Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim, precisely because the major of the Avodah Zarah of that time, in that period, deified and revered these animals, and therefore to break this, to contest these ideas, these conceptions, and to break the spell of these beliefs, we're being told to do the exact opposite. If they don't touch sheep, we are told specifically to sacrifice sheep. If they cannot roast it, we are told specifically to roast it, to do everything opposite to what they are doing. They would decorate the entrances to their homes with plants, with flowers and grasses and what have you. And we are told to place the blood of the sacrifice on the door, again, to stand out and be different. In other words, what we see here, as Rambam again points out many times in Moreh Nevuchim, the major thrust of the Torah is to uproot Avodah Zarah and set Am Yisrael apart, to separate Am Yisrael from the Umoth, from Umoth HaOlam, and to create an entirely different, parallel system, which is completely separate from all the systems, all the belief systems, all the practices of the nations. So yes, they may sacrifice as well, but we do things specifically in a different manner. And the major power and the major culture of that day, in this part of the world at least, in the Near East, was the Egyptian culture, which was extremely powerful and looked up to by all, a very ancient culture, extremely ancient. And although many people today do not realize this, Egyptian culture was a very, very extremely religious and spiritual culture. In other words, it was based on all kinds of spiritual conceptions and notions and beliefs and philosophies. The idea that people have today, which is really a 19th century idea, that arrogant, Austrian, German professors came up with in the 19th century, that all these ancient peoples were primitive and didn't understand anything and were not very advanced at all, and just all their ideas were simply to be ridiculed in every possible way. That actually is entirely untrue. Many of the ancient cultures, although they were steeped in Avodah Zarah and ideas that were wrong and misleading and very pernicious and harmful and detrimental to humankind in many ways. On the other hand, they also perceived many truths, and they understood that there was a spiritual dimension to reality, to life. They understood that life doesn't come from nowhere. They weren't stupid enough to believe what many people today believe, that a universe creates itself, or that life creates itself, and everything we see in all living systems and all living organisms, these things are somehow by chance developed over a long period of time. In other words, the kinds of ideas that came into vogue from Darwin onwards. Not that Darwin says anything at all, by the way, about the origin of life. He speaks about the origin of species, nothing to do with the origin of life. But people developed it. They chose to develop it and to extend it to other areas, well beyond what Darwin was describing and anticipated. So today, people think they're very clever. A lot of people today think that, well, we're advanced and we have computers and we have all kinds of technologies, and we understand that there's no God and there's no spirituality, doesn't exist. Any such talk about life after death or spirituality or a creator or anything, any spiritual force, anything that beyond that which we can observe or detect with our senses or with our instruments, is simply non-existent. And the joke, or the sad part about all of this, is that the joke is on them, because these are exceedingly stupid ideas that are even a rational person just thinking logically will understand is completely impossible, as many scientists today in the fields of molecular biology and evolution, etc., understand that it's that Darwinism has basically been proved to be incorrect. One can read many books and see many videos about these topics. The information is out there. In ancient times, all people knew or almost all people knew, except perhaps for a handful of certain Greek philosophers, and they're also a minority within that Greek world. All people knew that something does not come from nothing, and there has to be something behind all of this. And they understood that there is a spiritual dimension. They were seeking somehow to connect to that spiritual dimension. Religion, spirituality were very real things to these people. The Egyptians were very religious people. The Torah, which of course is based on that same essential understanding that something does not come from nothing, and if there is a creation, that means it was created, and that means there's some higher power, or maybe many higher powers in the pagan conception of these things. The Torah, of course, thinks the same thing about the reality of such a spiritual dimension, but it provides a different message and a different framework, which points to one creator and one way of connecting to that creator. So the Jewish people's task is to be human beings and to engage with the world and live in the created world. And in some ways we are similar to other nations, but in other words, by virtue of our biology, of our human condition. But essentially our purpose is to be entirely different. If you see the first this first pasuk quoted here, number 1, Wahaluhoth, Luchot, the tablets of stone that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down in Sefer Shemoth. Ma'aseh Elohim hema, michtav Elohim hu haruth al haluchot. That the words were engraved on the stone tablets, and this was a Ma'aseh Elohim. This was the work, the handiwork of Hashem. And we have the statement in the additional perek to Masechet Avot, perek Shishi of Avot, quoted here: Haruth ala luchot, al tikre haruth, ela heruth. The word, of course, can be read heruth, just as it can be read haruth. She'en lecha ben horin ela mi she'osek b'talmud Torah. V'chol mi she'osek b'Torah tavir harei ze mit'aleh. And a similar statement appears at source number 3 in Avot Rabbi Nathan, Al tikre haruth ela heruth, shekol mi she'osek b'Torah harei hu ben horin la'asmo. The emphasis here is on the word la'asmo. In other words, Am Yisrael's purpose is to be la'asmo. This is not just being said about the individual. This is also true for the Jewish people. Am Yisrael can be bnei horin and can live up to their purpose, their divinely ordained destiny and purpose on earth, when they are connected to the Torah, by being asuk b'Torah, by living according to the Torah. And then they are le'asmam, they are separate, they are different. As the Pasuk states, wa'avdil atchem min ha'amim, I will separate you from the nations. So all of the Torah, all of Yahadut is about separation, about distinction, about discernment, things not being the same. We are not supposed to be the same as others. We are supposed to be different. And that is Am Yisrael's purpose, to be different. It's a strange thing when you think about it. Nowadays, one of the catchwords of the current iteration of Western culture is diversity. People speak about how wonderful it is to have diversity. But in fact, as we all know, it's not real diversity that these people who speak about, who use this term all the time, it's not really diversity they want. They actually want everyone to think and live the same. So if you refuse to admit that a man can be a woman, for example, or vice versa, then you can't hold such a view. That is a criminal offense. I'm not joking. There are certain countries in the world where people have been put on trial for making such a statement. As difficult as it is as it might be to believe, but that is the fact. So diversity is just a catchphrase, but really they want everyone to think the same, to be the same. And this is, of course, also what's going on in Israel today. There are those who want the Jewish state to be the same as every other country, or certain types of countries, shall we say Western countries. And from their perspective, the greatest possible disaster is that the country might be somehow a little bit different from those countries to which they look up. But this, of course, is precisely the opposite of the Torah. The other part of the Jewish people knows that the more different we are, the more Jewish we are, the more real we are, the more we are that which we are supposed to be. We see, for example, in Chot Avodah Zarah and Perek Yud Aleph, Rambam begins this perek, and fittingly, this section of halachot is usually people refer to it in shorthand as Hilchot Avodah Zarah, but really it's Hilchot Avodah Zarah v'Hilchot HaGoyim, because all these halachot, all these chapters, all these 12 chapters in the Mishneh Torah, which are a summary of all that we find in Masechet Avodah Zarah and in many other places in the Mishnah, in the Talmudim, and the Baraitoth. It's all about being different from the Goyim. So Rambam writes here famously at the beginning of this perek, "En holachim b'chokot hagoyim." The word holachim doesn't mean to walk; it means to behave, to habitually act, to live one's life. We do not live, act, and behave like the nations. V'lo middamim lahem, and we do not try and imitate them in any way. Lo b'malbush, lo b'se'ar, not the way we dress, not the way we cut our hair. שנאמר ולא תלכו בחוקות הגוי. ונאמר, and it says ובחוקותיהם לא תלכו. You shall not act as they do. You shall not live, should not behave as they do. Why not? Hisham alecha, because it says Hisham alecha pen tinachesh acharehem. Because if you do, you begin to act, also even to think as they do. Thinking is actually even worse than acting. If you begin to act like they do, you begin also to think as they do. And if you think like as they do, well, then you're lost. And you as an individual. And if it's Am Yisrael, then Am Yisrael is lost. Hakol be'inyan echad hu masih. This is all about one principle, one rule of thumb, says Rambam. Shelo yidam elahim, not to be like them. Ela yeh Yisraeli. The Jew has to be muvdal mehem, separate, different, distinct. Uyadua b'malbusho v'shar ma'asao. Kamo shehu muvdal mehem b'mada'o v'de'otho, as he is different and distinct from them in his ideology and in his midot, in his behavior, in the way he conducts himself. V'chen hu omer u'avdil etchem min ha'amim. In the entire Torah is about this, and many things in the Torah. The Rambam points out, both here but also more particularly at greater length in Moreh Nevuchim, that many things in the Torah are designed precisely to act as a counterweight to, or as a counterpoint to the beliefs and the practices of the Goyim. And this is exactly why there is an isur of tisporeth harosh, of cutting our hair in a certain way, shaving our head in a certain way, and the same is true of shaving our beards, as the Goyim do. This is all, Rambam says clearly, all to be separate and different and stand out from them. And this is an essential message that we should discuss regularly, but certainly at Leila Seder, we should dwell upon this fact that we are supposed to be different, and that is the entire purpose of the Jewish people, to be different, to create a different, distinct, and vastly superior civilization and culture and society. And we are not squeamish or shy about saying, we should not be shy about saying this. The Pasuk describes us explicitly. Hashem says that I have separated you from the nations and I took you out of Mitzrayim, to make you, to place you above all other nations. And this, of course, is the cause of anti-Semitism altogether. Why has there always been anti-Semitism? because people don't like this idea that you think you're different, and not only think you're different, you think you're better. Well, yes, we do, and we're also right. But that doesn't mean everyone likes to hear that. And we're here to provide an example and to show people the way. L'or goyim, a light unto the nations. And that is why we are instructed to be a mamlechet kohanim v'choy kadosh. The only way to be a unique and separate and holy type of nation is to live in a completely distinct and different way. And it is a mistake to think that this only applies to a Jew living in Chutz La'aretz. It applies just as much to Jews living at the present time in Eretz Yisrael. In some ways, it applies even more so to Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, because many Jews think, well, here in Israel, everyone's Jewish, which is far from being true. To be precise, 2/3 of the Israeli population is Jewish, and 1/3 is not. Those are the real figures. The official figures are not 66%, but 70.7% or something Jewish. But that's also not terribly high, but that's also not true. The real figure is something like 65, 66%, because of the way they count people who's Jewish and what have you. So many people tell themselves, well, here everyone's Jewish, it's not a problem. And we don't have to be so different and don't have to stand out. And that's precisely wrong. People have to know, and they have to teach their children, that we have to be completely different from these other people who for whatever reason are not imbued with the spirit of the Torah, who do not live according to the words and the instructions and the directions and the precepts of the Torah. In some ways, it's more necessary to make that point than even in Eretz Yisrael today than in Chutz La'aretz. In Chutz La'aretz, it's fairly easy for a Jew to, let's say an Orthodox Jew, any type of Orthodox Jew, he has a community, he has a shul, he has a synagogue, he knows other Jews, they meet all the time on Shabbat, on Hagim, or what have you. They have the social events. You can lead a life quite distinct and separate from most of the people around you who are not Jewish or who are not Torah oriented. In Eretz Yisrael, we have many challenges which a person does not necessarily have to deal with in Chutz La'aretz. And one of those challenges is that all these other people who look and think and talk like Goyim are not. And that can confuse you. But we have to keep in mind the pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. Pasuk Samach Gimel, Perek Kof Yotef. Haver ani lechol asher yireucha. I am a colleague and a friend towards all those who fear you, uleshomeret pikudacha, those who observe your commandments. This has to be one of the underlying messages that we always think about, is always in the back of our minds. We remind ourselves and remind our families and our associates that this is an essential point and lesson for all Jews to think and be mindful of at all times. The purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim was to remove us from that very ancient, very powerful, and very impressive culture and civilization of Mitzrayim. The Jews were completely immersed in that culture, as we know. We know, for example, of the statement. We have a statement in the Mechillatha, Parashat B'Shalach, on the pasuk of Vnei Yisrael harachu b'yabasha b'toch hayam. So it says that Am Yisrael were walking on dry land, and the Egyptians were about to be drowned, or were being drowned. And the angels raised their eyebrows, and they said, B'nei Adam Ovdei Avodah Zarah, these people who are Ovdei Avodah Zarah, Mahalechim Be'abasha B'toch Hayam, they are walking on dry land. And why is that? Because they're not very different from these Egyptians. In the words of Midrash Shoher Tov, first Mizmor, there it says, Elu Mechale Arayoth, Elu Mechale Arayoth, Elu Shofechei Damim, Elu Shofechei Damim. The Lashon is much stronger. In other words, at that point, Am Yisrael were not so very different, except for the fact that they were the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Apart from this essential difference, that they were chosen by Hashem, that these descendants of those Avoth were chosen to be a Mamlechet Kohanim and Goy Kadosh, they were not very different. At that particular moment, they were very similar. The Jewish people were assimilated amongst the Egyptians in most ways. It's true they maintained a certain self-identity and separateness, at least according to some sources. They kept their names and their form of dress and their language, but in most other aspects of their lives, they were immersed in Egyptian culture, which was steeped in Avodah Zarah and ideas which are the opposite of what the Torah is aimed at achieving in this world. So the Jewish people were removed from that reality in order to become a different nation, a different type of person, and people, in order to receive the Torah and to become Bnei Horin Be'emeth. As we said, Harut ala luchot, Herut ala luchot. By accepting the Torah and living and thinking in Torah terms about all things at all times, only then are we Bnei Horin, and only then can we be Jewish, truly Jewish, separate, different, and dedicated to Hashem. As the Pasuk says, Am zu yatharti li tehiloti yisaperu. If we are the Am that Hashem created, that received the Torah, then tehiloti yisaperu. These are some of the things that I think we should dwell upon all days of the year, and certainly during Pesach and Bela Seder. We'll stop here for today. Hayu Beruchim. I wish everybody have Sameach, have Chag Masof Sameach. Unfortunately, it will not be. It will be a Pesach Chag HaMasot without a Korban Pesach. I do not believe that the Mikdash will fall from heaven between now and Yud Daled B'Nisan. So that is my assumption. And this is precisely another thing that we must mention at the Seder, that this is not how a Seder is supposed to be. And the fact that we are in this situation is perhaps one of the most obvious and damning proofs that we have not managed yet to get our act together, to be a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. Many Jewish people still think in totally non-Jewish terms, and that is why the reality is still far from being where it should be, far from being perfect. So we have much work ahead of us, and every Pesach is like another a booster shot, if you forgive the term. I think you have a view about vaccines, but Pesach is like a booster shot. we'll end with this thought. The Netziv writes in his Perush on Sefer Shemoth, Parashat Bo, that the Psukim could make the connection between Yitziat Misraim and the Mitzvah of Tefillin. And he explains that the Mitzvah of Tefillin is like a mini Pesach that you perform every day. Right? The Pasuk states, let us open up the Pasuk for a moment. We have here in Shemoth Perek Yud Gimel, Parashat Kadesh Li Chol Bechor. So it begins speaking about the Mitzvah of Pidyon Bechor, which also has to do with Yitziat Mitzrayim. Vayomer Moshe el Ha'am Zachor Hayom Hazeh She'yatzatem Ben Mitzrayim Mibet Ha'avodim. And then it goes on to speak about the Mitzvah of some of the Mitzvot to do with Pesach. Shivat Yamim Tochal Masoth, V'yom HaShiv'i Hag Lavonai, Masoth Ya'achel Et Shivat HaYamim, V'lo Yira'eh Lecha Hames, V'lo Yira'eh Lecha Sa'or B'chol Gevulecha, all the various Mitzvot pertaining to Pesach. And then it tells us, V'higav Torah V'incha B'yom Hahu Lemor, and you must relate all these things and explain all these things to your children on that day, that is to say, on Pesach. So that we should become this special nation with this unique culture, this unique Torah. And all of a sudden, Mitzvah Tefillin is mentioned here. So there's a clear connection between Tefillin and Yitziat Mitzrayim. The Netziv explains that it is like an important lesson that a father wishes to convey to his son. So when he's of the right age, at the right time, he sits him down and he gives him a long talk and he explains the whole matter to his son at length. And he asks his son, do you understand what I've taught you? He says, yes. Okay, fine, off you go. The next day, he calls his son over and he says, you remember what we spoke about yesterday? The son says, yes, sure. He says, okay, fine, you can go. And every day he asks him, remember what we spoke about? Yes, father, okay, fine. But once a year, the father sits him down again and tells him the whole story once from beginning to end. The whole idea, the message, whatever it was he was trying to convey, he tells him the whole thing again, not in shorthand version, a long version, the complete and uncensored version. In the same way, the Netziv says, we have Pesach once a year to remind us of this central message and concept of who we are and why we are. And this we remind ourselves at great length by going through all the various, performing all the mitzvot, observing all the mitzvot, and going through the seder. And we should have a Korban Pesach as part of that seder, and the mitzvot to do with Hashbatat Sa'or and Hametz, and Lo Yira'eh Lo Yimaseh, which is a very unusual mitzvah, not even to have it in your possession. Not just that you can't eat it, you can't even have it in your possession. All these things are obviously in order to grab our attention and focus our minds on why we are doing these things. And that is once a year. on a daily basis, we have tefillin, which is like a mini reminder, a small reminder of everything to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim. The parashiyot, the 4 parashiyot in the tefillin, 2 of them mention Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's a central aspect of the mitzvah of tefillin, and it's like that daily reminder. So we have before us, in a couple of days' time, we have the annual major event, which is, I think, in many ways, we should view as the high point of the year, and the most important, most meaningful days in the Jewish year, the Jewish calendar. May we, B'ezrat Hashem, fully imbibe and internalize these messages, these ideas, and be able to remind ourselves of these things every day of the year until the next major lesson in a year's time, B'ezrat Hashem. Hayu baruchim, hizku v'ames levavchem kol ha'meyahalim l'Adonai.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.